The Oberon was a marvel of human engineering, a sleek black vessel capable of faster-than-light travel and equipped with the latest in advanced technology. But as the crew gathered in the briefing room, the mood was heavy, the weight of their mission hanging over them. Captain Elara Winters stood before them, her usual confidence tempered by the gravity of the situation. She could see the fear in her crew's eyes, some of them veterans of deep space missions, others fresh-faced and eager. "Listen up," Winters said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "We've been selected for this mission, not just because we have the best ship, but because humanity can't afford to fail. The Orcs aren't just sending us to observe, they're asking for help. We can't let fear dictate our actions. We will face the unknown, but we will face it together." The crew nodded, but the sense of unease didn't dissipate. Everyone had heard the stories, the terrifying account of a team of Orcs explorers that had ventured into the same region of space and never returned. The signal they had intercepted was the last transmission from that mission, a chilling plea for help, describing the Shrouded beacon as a dark, insatiable force capable of erasing civilizations in the blink of an eye. But the most unsettling part was the conclusion, an alien voice, distorted and frantic, warning of a cosmic plague that was spreading from the beacon's epicenter. The Oberon wasn't just going to investigate. The mission was more urgent than that. The signal had indicated that the beacon's dark influence was reaching farther, faster than anyone had predicted. Earth was at risk. Captain Winters, who had led countless missions into unknown territories, knew that this would be her most dangerous yet. But what she didn't know was that this mission would not only test their survival, but their understanding of what it meant to be human. Lieutenant Jonah Rios, the Oberon's lead pilot, was the first to speak up. "Captain, are we sure this is the right move? If the Orcs couldn't stop it, what makes us think we can?" Winters met his gaze, her expression hardening. "We have something they don't: determination. Humanity has always been about pushing the limits, even when the odds are stacked against us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. It wasn't arrogance, but faith in the strength of the human spirit that set Earth apart from the rest of the galaxy. Humanity had survived war, famine, and division. What was a cosmic anomaly compared to the trials they had already overcome? Chief Engineer Sophia Tan leaned forward, her fingers hovering over the holographic table, where a rotating map of their destination flickered. "The Orcs claim no one has survived the beacon, but there's something else. The signal they sent is strange. It's like it's reaching out, almost like the beacon is calling us." "I don't like the sound of that," muttered Sergeant Marcus Dre, the ship's security chief, adjusting his rifle. "Are we sure this beacon is some kind of anomaly? It could be a trap." Dre's skepticism was shared by some of the crew. The Orcs were powerful, yet their warning seemed desperate, hinting at something much more mysterious. But Winters dismissed their concerns, knowing that if they didn't act now, the beacon would spread beyond containment. They had no choice but to follow through. As the Oberon slipped into hyperdrive, hurtling toward the unknown, the crew fell silent, each person contemplating the enormity of what lay ahead. The vastness of space seemed to press in on them, the darkness endless, but beyond it, somewhere in the unknown, the beacon waited, its shrouded power drawing them ever closer. The Oberon tore through the fabric of space, its engines humming steadily, but a palpable tension clung to the air. The journey to the Shrouded beacon had begun, and with each passing day, the crew was pulled deeper into the unknown. Outside the ship's reinforced hull, stars streaked by a blur of brilliant light, but inside, an unsettling quiet had fallen over the crew. Captain Winters paced the command deck, her eyes glued to the navigational screens, every detail of the void around them catalogued. The crew had crossed the point of no return. Earth was now far behind them, a distant blue dot on the edge of the known galaxy. The enormity of their mission weighed heavily on her shoulders. She could see the strain in her crew's eyes, each of them aware of the same truth. no one had returned from the region they were venturing into. Lieutenant Jonah Rios, always the optimist, tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes in the galley and organizing training drills, but even his usual levity was waning. The unpredictability of deep space was already beginning to erode the sense of security they had once taken for granted. As the days turned to weeks, strange anomalies began to manifest, small at first, an odd flicker in the ship's sensors, a brief static in the communications feed. But it was enough to set the crew on edge. Sophia Tan, the ship's chief engineer, stood over her station, fingers flying across the controls. "Captain, something's wrong with the energy output from the warp drive," she reported, her voice tense. "It's fluctuating in ways that don't make sense." Winters turned to her, narrowing her eyes. "Explain?" "The energy readings are inconsistent. It's like the warp field is being disrupted by some kind of gravitational anomaly. I can't isolate the cause yet." Winter's gut twisted. They hadn't even reached the beacon, and already they were being tested. "Keep me updated. We don't need any surprises." Rios, hovering nearby, added, "Maybe it's just space turbulence." "We're a long way from home, Captain. Space out here can get unpredictable." The crew tried to push through, each trying to focus on their tasks. But as they ventured farther into the vast darkness, the tension was palpable. The ship's sensors were picking up strange energy readings now, flashes of radiation in their wake. It wasn't like anything they'd ever encountered before, an unnatural pulse that rippled outward, distorting space itself, as if the very fabric of the universe was being bent in ways no one understood. One night, as the crew gathered for their usual watch, it became clear that whatever they were approaching wasn't natural. A sudden jolt rocked the ship, causing everything to lurch. The lights flickered, and the hum of the engines faltered for a moment before returning to normal. A deep, unsettling silence fell over the bridge. "Report," Winters barked, her voice sharp. Rios worked quickly at his console. "It's coming from the coordinates we're heading toward. Whatever it is, it's strong enough to interfere with our systems." Tan added her voice to the mix, her voice shaking. "It's like we're passing through a field of something we don't understand. The sensors are completely out of whack." A deep sense of foreboding gripped the crew. Every instinct told them to turn back, but that wasn't an option. The shrouded beacon was ahead, and the fate of Earth was tied to their mission. Suddenly, the ship lurched again, this time violently. Warning alarms blared. The artificial gravity flickered, and for a split second, the crew was weightless, floating in the air. The darkness outside the Oberon seemed to pulse, an eerie black mass looming ahead, its outline almost imperceptible. "Captain," Dre's voice crackled through the intercom, panic evident in his tone. "You need to see this." Winters stormed to the forward observation deck. What she saw froze her blood. The stars around them were fading, dimming as if they were being swallowed by an unseen force. The Oberon had entered the outskirts of the shrouded beacon's influence. The once constant light of distant stars was now being devoured, snuffed out one by one. It was as if the universe itself was being erased. "It's here," Winters whispered, the enormity of their mission finally settling over her. They had come face to face with something far beyond their understanding. The beacon was real, and it was far worse than they could have imagined. The stars were vanishing. One by one, they faded into an endless blackness that surrounded the Oberon like a vast, suffocating void. The crew stared out at the unfolding nightmare, their senses assaulted by the growing sense of dread. The ship was caught in the gravitational field of the shrouded beacon, its powerful pull distorting space itself. Light bent and twisted, leaving only darkness and strange, flickering bursts of energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The ship was trembling, its hull groaning under the strain. Captain Winters stood at the helm, gripping the command chair as though it could anchor her to reality. "Status report," she barked. Rios, his knuckles white from gripping his console, replied, "We're being pulled in, Captain. I can't get us out of the field. The systems are scrambling." His voice cracked. This shouldn't be possible. Sophia Tan, hunched over her terminal, was the next to speak. "The energy surges are unlike anything we've seen before. It's like the field is alive, Captain. It's manipulating our systems." "We need to get out of here," Lieutenant Rios muttered, his voice tinged with panic. "Whatever this thing is, it's more powerful than any of us can handle." Captain Winters clenched her jaw. Panic wasn't an option. "We don't turn back. We face this head-on." The rest of the crew exchanged uneasy glances. The Oberon was built for deep space exploration, but nothing in its design had prepared them for this, an anomaly so incomprehensible that even the Orcs, with all their technological superiority, had failed to understand its nature. But there was no turning back now. Suddenly, an alarm blared from the navigation station, a shrill warning that sent a ripple of alarm through the crew. "What is it?" Winters demanded, her eyes narrowing. "Something's coming in fast." Rios' voice was tight with urgency. "An object, but it's too dark to get a proper read. Oh God." Before he could finish, the Oberon lurched violently. The entire ship shook with a force that sent crew members stumbling. The lights flickered, the engines sputtering. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Time itself felt like it had been suspended. Then, as quickly as it started, the ship jerked again, throwing everyone off balance. The lights dimmed, leaving only the cold glow of emergency lighting. "Damage report," Winters ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. Tan's voice came through, shaken but composed. "Hull integrity is intact. Some of the external sensors have been damaged, minor, but enough to make it harder to track that object." "Object?" Winters repeated. "What are we dealing with?" A hissing sound filled the comms, and a distorted voice suddenly crackled through the speakers. It was faint, eerie, and unmistakably alien. "Help? Us?" The voice was barely audible, like a whisper from another dimension. It was inhuman, yet strangely familiar, a haunting echo that seemed to originate from within the beacon itself. The crew exchanged confused glances, each of them aware that the voice was not from any ship they knew of. The Orcs were silent. Their warnings had been recorded, but this was different. "We're not alone," Winters said softly. The words sent a chill down her spine. Whoever, or whatever, was sending that message had been trapped here, and it sounded desperate. Rios's hands flew over the controls, trying to get a clearer read on the transmission, but every attempt only seemed to distort the signal further, as if the beacon itself was blocking them from understanding it. And then, as if answering Winter's thoughts, something appeared in the darkness. A ship, ancient and derelict, its hull torn open, its lights flickering erratically as it drifted toward them. It wasn't just a ship, it was a warning, an omen of what lay ahead. "It's one of the Orcs ships," Dre said, his voice a mix of disbelief and horror. "But it's dead, like the others." The message had come from here, from this cursed place. The crew had arrived, and now they could feel the full weight of the beacon's malevolent power closing in on them. Whatever had destroyed the Orcs, whatever had torn apart their ships and their crew, was still here, and it was waiting. The Oberon drifted closer to the shattered wreckage of the Orcs vessel, its eerie silence filling the air. The dark mass of the shrouded beacon loomed larger in their viewports, a swirling void of annihilation that seemed to reach out to them like an ancient, hungry predator. Captain Winters stood at the helm, her jaw set, eyes scanning the damaged ship. It was a terrifying sight, once a symbol of technological supremacy, now a floating tomb, its outer hull pocked with blast marks, signs of violent disintegration. "Report," Winters commanded, her voice unflinching despite the horror unfolding before them. "Something's pulling us in, Captain," Lieutenant Rios replied, his hands working furiously on the controls. We're being caught in the debris field. There's a gravitational anomaly surrounding the wreckage. If we get too close, we'll be sucked into the beacon's core. Keep us steady, Winters ordered. We'll need to investigate. No one else has come back from this. We can't leave without answers. Dre, the security chief, grunted from his station. Are we sure we want to go poking around in that wreckage? It could be a trap. We don't have a choice, Winters said, her voice cold but resolute. The Orcs gave us this information for a reason. It's our only lead. Despite their misgivings, the crew followed Winters' orders. A small team, including Winters herself, Dre, and Sophia Tan, suited up in emergency gear and prepared to board the alien vessel. As they made their way to the airlock, there was a shared, unspoken anxiety among them. The Oberon was their lifeline to survival, and the moment they left its safety, they would be exposed to whatever lay within the Orcs' wreck. When the airlock cycled open, the team stepped into the darkened hull of the Orcs ship. The interior was a macabre sight. Alien machinery flickered weakly, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. It looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries, but the wreckage was far too recent. They could still see signs of activity, personal effects scattered, half-eaten meals left behind, the bodies of Orcs crew members frozen in twisted positions, as though they had died in the midst of some horrific event. The crew tried not to look too closely at the grisly sight, but there was no escaping the overwhelming sense of dread. What happened here? Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Dre scanned the room with a wary eye. It wasn't just battle damage. This looks like something tore through the ship from the inside. Winters moved forward, her boots echoing eerily in the silence. She approached a control panel, its interface sparking intermittently. With a few deft movements, she managed to bring it to life. The screen flickered, then stabilized, revealing a message, encrypted but still decipherable. The translation was incomplete, but the meaning was clear. The beacon, Winters murmured. They knew. The Orcs knew it was alive. Alive? Dre repeated, his tone skeptical but tinged with fear. This thing is a weapon. It's a trap. We can't think of it as alive. No, Winters said, her voice firm, the weight of her discovery heavy on her. This is something far worse. The beacon is not just a weapon, it's a sentient force, and it's consuming everything in its path. Sophia's eyes widened as she studied the panel's readout. It's not just pulling ships in, it's manipulating them, draining their life force, their energy. It's using them. As the team continued to sift through the wreckage, the strange energy pulses grew stronger, resonating through the wreck and the Oberon as well. The crew's skin prickled with the sensation that they were being watched, observed by an intelligence that was not their own. And then, as if to confirm their growing fears, a sudden sharp sound cut through the silence, an unnatural hum, echoing from deep within the wrecked ship. A high-pitched voice, distorted and garbled, crackled through the static. It was the same voice they had heard earlier, the one pleading for help. But now it sounded different, more desperate. The words were fragmented, barely coherent, but the tone was unmistakable. We are trapped inside, can't escape, don't, come closer. The transmission sputtered, then died. Winters felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The crew was not just investigating the beacon. They were now part of its trap. The Orcs had fallen victim to its pull, and now it was trying to pull them in as well. The question wasn't whether they could survive. The question was whether they could stop it before they, too, became part of the beacon's dark, endless cycle of consumption. The air aboard the Oberon was thick with tension as the team made their way back to the ship. The wreckage of the Orcs vessel loomed in the distance, a silent testament to the fate that awaited anyone who ventured too close to the shrouded beacon. The crew had returned to the Oberon, but the darkness had already begun to seep into their minds. The haunting transmission, the eerie silence, and the discovery of the ship's twisted, empty interior weighed heavily on them. Captain Winters didn't need to look at the others to know that the resolve of her crew was beginning to falter. They had crossed into uncharted territory, both physically and mentally, and now the true nature of their mission was becoming chillingly clear. The Shrouded beacon wasn't just a cosmic anomaly. It was a malignant, sentient force, capable of consuming not just matter, but entire civilizations, minds, and histories. Back aboard the Oberon, Winters gathered the crew in the briefing room. The tension was palpable. Everyone could feel it, the pull of the beacon, a presence growing stronger with every passing minute. "Report," Winters said, her voice calm but commanding. Sophia Tan was the first to speak. "The Oberon is holding up, but the energy surges are getting worse. We're already operating on backup systems. The damage is accelerating." She shook her head. "Whatever it is, the beacon isn't just distorting our sensors. It's actively sabotaging our technology, draining our power." Lieutenant Rios added, "We're also seeing more of those pulses, distorted frequencies coming from the beacon itself. The closer we get, the more intense the interference becomes. It's as if it's calling to us." Dre crossed his arms, his face grim. "That's exactly what the Orcs were trying to warn us about. Whatever the hell that thing is, it's not just pulling us in physically. It's getting into our heads. Those transmissions, they weren't just a plea for help. They were trying to stop us from coming closer." The crew fell silent. The Orcs were an advanced race, and if they had failed to understand or stop the beacon, what hope did humanity have? "We can't stop," Winters said, her voice hard. "If we don't reach the core and understand what this thing is, it will spread. Earth, the Orcs, all of us will be consumed by it. We either stop it, or we become part of it." There was a long pause. Dre's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. He knew there was no other choice. They couldn't turn back. Sophia spoke up again, her voice quiet. "Captain, there's something else. When we were on the Orc ship, I found something buried in the data logs. It's not just energy signatures or gravitational anomalies. The beacon is connected to something much older, a cosmic entity that has existed far longer than even the Orcs." Winters frowned. "An entity? It's not clear," Sophia continued, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But it's like the beacon is, part of it, a piece of it. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like it's alive. The ship's data suggested that the Orcs were searching for it, but when they got too close, they awakened something. It's not just a tool, it's a predator, and we're its next prey." A cold silence filled the room. The implications were horrifying. The Oberon was now orbiting the edge of something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined, an ancient, sentient entity whose reach extended beyond time and space, and they were about to walk straight into its heart. Suddenly, the Oberon shook again, more violently this time. The lights flickered, the hum of the engines sputtered, and the crew braced themselves. Through the viewport, the beacon grew even more ominous, an expanding mass of swirling darkness that seemed to pulse with a terrible energy. "It's happening," Rios said, his voice tight. "It's trying to pull us in. It's not just manipulating our systems, it's trying to control us." Winters felt a surge of determination flood her chest. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. "Prepare to break through. We'll make it to the core. We have no choice." The crew moved quickly, each person knowing their role, but none of them could shake the growing sense that they were no longer in control of the situation. As they approached the beacon's core, they could feel the pressure building, an invisible force that pushed against the ship, warping the space around them. Time felt distorted here, seconds stretching and contracting like a pulse. They were close, closer than anyone had ever dared to go. But the closer they came, the clearer it became. The true horror of the Shrouded beacon wasn't just in its power to destroy. It was in the way it consumed everything it touched, life, knowledge, time itself. And now, humanity had become its next victim. The Oberon inched closer to the heart of the Shrouded beacon, and the space around them twisted with an unnatural force. The walls of the ship groaned as the gravitational pull increased, each passing second feeling like they were sinking deeper into a nightmare. The core of the beacon loomed ahead, an oppressive presence in the darkness, a swirling mass of void and light that defied all laws of physics. The crew felt it, an invisible pressure that pressed on their minds and their bodies, a cold, suffocating weight that threatened to crush them. Captain Winters stood at the helm, her hands gripping the controls with a vice-like grip, fighting to keep the Oberon on course. She could feel the ship's systems faltering under the strain, the sensors flickering, and the hum of the engines stuttering in and out of sync. But the worst part wasn't the ship, it was the feeling in her chest, the creeping sense of dread that something was watching them. "Keep us steady, Rios," she commanded, her voice tight with focus. "We're almost there." Rios, beads of sweat on his brow, nodded. "Aye, Captain. But I don't know how much longer we can hold out. The ship's systems are fighting us, and the beacon's pull is getting worse." Sophia Tan's voice came over the comm, strained and urgent. "Captain, I'm seeing strange energy readings in the core. It's like it's breathing, almost. It's fluctuating between high and low frequencies, and every time we get closer, it intensifies." "Keep monitoring it, Sophia," Winters said. Her eyes were fixed on the viewport, watching as the massive mass of darkness grew larger, swallowing all light. It was as if the universe itself was collapsing inward. She couldn't tear her gaze away. She had to know what lay at the center, even if it meant risking everything. They couldn't turn back now. Dre's voice cut through the tension. "Captain, I don't like this. Every instinct is screaming at me to get the hell out of here, but we can't. Not anymore. Whatever this thing is, it's alive, and it knows we're here." Before Winters could respond, the ship suddenly jerked violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered and then died, leaving the crew in an eerie darkness lit only by the emergency red lights. The hum of the engines cut out, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Rios was the first to speak, panic rising in his voice. "We've lost power. It's pulling us in faster than we can react." The Oberon was now spiraling toward the center of the beacon, the gravitational pull of the dark mass pulling at them with an unnatural force. Every system on the ship was shutting down, one by one. The ship was no longer under their control. They were at the mercy of the beacon. "What's happening?" Winters demanded, her voice shaking for the first time. I don't know, Captain," Rios stammered. "It's like the ship is being erased. I'm trying to regain control, but the controls are malfunctioning. Something's hijacking the ship's systems." The crew could feel it now. The ship was no longer the only thing being pulled in. It was them, each of them individually, as if the beacon itself was reaching into their minds. A sudden wave of vertigo hit, and they staggered, feeling their thoughts grow fuzzy and disjointed. And then the voice came again, the same distorted, inhuman voice they had heard before. But now it wasn't just a whisper. It was all around them, echoing in their minds, scraping against their thoughts like nails on a chalkboard. "Join us. You are ours now." Winters gritted her teeth, shaking her head to clear the disorienting voice. She couldn't let it take her. They couldn't let it take them. Not yet. "We're not your prey," Winters shouted, her voice breaking through the oppressive atmosphere. "We won't fall for this." But the voice continued, louder now, echoing in their ears, their minds. "You will become one with us. We are the beginning and the end. You are already ours." Sophia collapsed to her knees, clutching her head as if trying to block out the voice. Dre stumbled, his eyes wide with terror as he reached out to the others, but his voice was lost in the rising chaos. The air was thick, heavy with something otherworldly, and the walls of the Oberon seemed to pulse in time with the beat of the beacon's dark heart. For a moment, everything seemed to blur together. The Oberon, the crew, the beacon, it was all becoming one. Their sense of self, Their understanding of reality was slipping away piece by piece. They were being swallowed, drawn into the darkness. And then, just as it seemed all hope was lost, Captain Winters made a final desperate decision. She activated the emergency override, forcing the last reserves of power into the ship's remaining thrusters. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to break free, if only for a moment. With a deafening roar, the Oberon surged forward, fighting against the gravity of the beacon, pulling away just enough to regain some control. But the struggle was far from over. The beacon's grip was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before it pulled them all under. But Winters wouldn't give in, not yet, not while there was still breath in her body. The battle for survival had only just begun. The Oberon lurched forward, its engines sputtering as the last reserves of power surged through the ship. For a brief moment, the crew felt a fleeting sense of hope, a false dawn as the ship regained some semblance of control. But it was short-lived. The beacon's pull was relentless, like a living thing, wrapping its tendrils around the Oberon's fragile frame, dragging it back into the abyss. Captain Winters slammed her fist onto the control panel. "No, we're not giving up," she shouted, voice hoarse from exertion and desperation. The ship groaned in protest as the remaining thrusters fought the overwhelming force, but they were losing. The crew was losing. Sophia Tan, pale and trembling, scrambled to reroute power through the auxiliary systems. "The pulse, it's getting worse. Whatever that thing is, it's becoming aware of us. It's adapting to our efforts." Her eyes were wide with terror, scanning the readings on her console. "It's feeding off our energy. It's getting stronger every second." Winters clenched her jaw. They were at the mercy of a force they couldn't understand, an intelligence that had existed for eons, devouring civilizations in its wake. If they didn't act now, they would become just another lost relic, a part of the beacon's endless consumption. But she wouldn't let that happen. She couldn't let humanity become one more casualty of the universe's indifference. "We need to break through," Winters said through gritted teeth. "There has to be a way to reach the core. We can't just fight the pull, we need to understand it. If we can't stop it, we can at least destroy it." Dre, who had been silent for too long, spoke up. His voice was cold, his usual bravado replaced by a grim determination. "There's one way. It's a long shot, but it's our only chance. The ship has a failsafe, an emergency protocol built into the core's control system. If we can get to the central chamber, we might be able to overload the beacon's energy fields and force it to destabilize. But it's going to be a one-way trip. We're talking about detonating the entire core." Rios shook his head, disbelief and fear in his eyes. "That's insane. We're too close. We'll be vaporized before we even get to the control room." "It's the only option we have left," Winters said, voice steady. "We're going to fight back, no matter what. We'll make it work." With no time to waste, Winters turned to the crew. "Dre, Rios, you're with me. Sophia, stay here and keep the ship from falling apart. We're going to the core." Sophia nodded, though her face was pale with fear. "I'll do what I can, Captain, but be careful. You're not just going to fight the beacon. You're going to have to fight the minds it's already corrupted. If it takes hold of you, you won't make it back." The gravity of her words hung in the air as the crew moved into action. Dre and Rios suited up and followed Winters to the lower levels of the ship, making their way toward the central control room with grim resolve. Every step felt heavier, as though the ship itself was trying to hold them back. The wall seemed to pulse in time with the rhythm of the beacon's dark energy, a constant reminder of the growing threat. As they reached the access door to the core chamber, the air felt thick with static, like the ship was being consumed by the beacon's very presence. The crew's minds were buzzing with distorted thoughts, whispers just beyond the edge of comprehension, and cold, suffocating fear. Dre gritted his teeth. "It's messing with us, Captain. The beacon is trying to break us down." "We can't let it," Winters replied, determination in her eyes. She activated the override on the door, and the panel slid open with a hiss. Inside was the heart of the ship, a shimmering, unstable power source linked directly to the core's main conduit. The moment the door opened, the presence of the beacon slammed into them like a physical blow. The hum of the ship amplified, and they felt it, a pulse of power so intense it seemed to burn their skin. For a brief moment, everything felt wrong. The room bent around them, warping like a dream, and the very walls seemed to twist and shimmer with unnatural energy. "You'll never escape," a voice whispered inside their minds, a cacophony of distorted sounds. It was the beacon, reaching into their thoughts, pulling at their deepest fears and desires. "You will become one with us. All will be consumed. All is mine." Dre staggered, his mind fighting against the pull, but his resolve didn't waver. "We're not your prisoners," he snarled, his fists clenching. "We're human, and we fight." Winters moved to the core's control panel, fighting through the confusion that clouded her mind. She pressed the activation sequence, and the room began to hum with intense energy. The countdown started, a faint but unmistakable sound, and the core began to pulse in response. "We've got to get out of here now," Rios shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. The walls were shaking violently as the ship seemed to tremble under the power surge. The core was about to reach critical mass. "We can't leave until it's done," Winters said, steeling herself. "Brace yourselves." The countdown continued, and the Oberon shuddered as if it were alive, the dark energy from the beacon attempting to smother them, to stop them. But they wouldn't stop. Not while humanity's future hung in the balance. The core was primed, and with one final push, they were ready to ignite the explosion that would shatter the beacon's hold on the galaxy. The room was vibrating with the power of the core, the pulsing energy intensifying with every passing second. The countdown was ticking away relentlessly, and Winters could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The core, now fully activated, hummed with a destructive force that seemed to be reaching out, clawing at the very fabric of space around them. The beacon's influence on the ship was becoming unbearable. The walls bent and distorted, reality itself flickering like a dying light. They had no time left. "We've done it," Winters said, her voice taut but resolute, despite the chaos around her. "The core is primed to overload. It'll destabilize the beacon's energy, break its hold, but we need to get back to the Oberon before the explosion happens. If we don't, we'll be caught in the shockwave." Rios was already moving toward the door, his face a mask of determination. "Captain, we need to move now. The beacon's fighting back harder. I don't think the ship will survive this." The air was thick with tension as they made their way back down the corridor, the sounds of the ship groaning under pressure, the walls reverberating as the power surge ramped up. The ship felt less like a vessel and more like an entity itself, its internal structure warping with every step they took. It was alive, or at least something far beyond their understanding of life. A monster that had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was awake, determined to consume them. As they neared the escape hatch, the wall seemed to pulse, and the voice returned, louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape." It was no longer just a whisper, but a screeching chorus, 100 voices merging into one powerful force. The beacon was inside their minds now, reaching deep into their subconscious, pulling at their most vulnerable thoughts. It wanted them to give in, to surrender. "Join us. You are ours now." Winters shook her head, blocking out the voice as best as she could. She focused on the one thing that mattered, the Oberon. The final step in their mission. They could not, would not, allow themselves to be consumed. "We're almost there," Dre grunted, his hand gripping the edge of the bulkhead as the ship shuddered again. They were nearly at the hatch, just a few more meters, but the beacon's grip tightened, and the corridor ahead seemed to twist unnaturally. Time itself was warping, each step feeling like an eternity. The ship groaned louder, more violently now, as if it were screaming in agony. And yet, Winters and her crew pressed forward. "We don't have time for this," Winters muttered. She thrust open the hatch and stepped into the emergency transport chamber. The others followed quickly, and she slammed the door shut behind them. The small transport shuttle hummed to life as Rios quickly engaged the launch sequence. The small craft shot forward, detaching from the main body of the Oberon. For a brief moment, there was silence, a feeling of weightlessness as they escaped the confines of the doomed ship. But as the shuttle shot away from the core, the Oberon's engines sputtered and then exploded, an immense, blinding flash that engulfed everything. In that moment, the shockwave ripped through space, a force so powerful it shattered the very fabric of the void around them. The crew was thrown forward, bracing themselves as the shuttle was tossed in the aftermath of the explosion. Outside, the shrouded beacon flared briefly, as though it were fighting back against the shockwave, but it was already too late. The energy of the explosion sent shockwaves through the core, destabilizing the beacon's power and causing it to collapse in on itself. The shuttle was knocked off course, spinning wildly through the darkness, but Rios fought to stabilize it, his hands moving with practiced precision. The crew struggled to stay conscious, the blinding light of the explosion still seared in their minds. Are we safe?" Dre gasped, clutching his seat. Winters, still gripping the armrests with white knuckles, looked out at the space ahead of them. The shrouded beacon, once a vast, terrible presence, was no longer visible. It had imploded, its immense power disappearing into the void, leaving nothing behind but the scars it had left on the galaxy. "We did it," Winters said, her voice soft but filled with awe. "We stopped it. Humanity. We survived." The shuttle slowly righted itself as the crew began to recover, their bodies aching from the strain of the battle. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. They had fought an enemy older than civilization, a force that had the power to unmake everything. And yet, in the end, it had been humanity's resilience, its unyielding spirit, that had triumphed. As they set course back toward Earth, their home, the crew sat in silence, each one processing the journey they had just completed. The universe, vast and unknowable, had thrown its worst at them. But humanity had stood firm, a beacon in the darkness, a light that would never be extinguished. They had illuminated the unknown, and in doing so, had ensured their place in the stars. The journey was over, but their legacy would live on,